Today, I'm going to show you how to do basic maintenance on a custom loop. Stay tuned. Now today's goal is no leaks. It's been about a year since I water cooled this system right here, and honestly, it's about time for some maintenance. Today, I'm simply going to change the fluid and repaste the CPU block. But while we have it apart, it's a really good idea to look around at things that may be dirty that you may have to clean. As of right now, everything looks pretty good in this thing, so I think we're just going to be okay with changing the fluid and doing the repaste. However, if we find anything once we dig into it, we'll take care of that once we get to it. Another motivation that I have for doing this maintenance today is I want to steal that video card out of here, and I figure I'm going to have to drain the loop to do it anyway, so I might as well take it while we're doing the maintenance. There's some things that you're going to need before you actually start to attempt this, and it's all going to depend on how your system is set up. Like for instance, I highly recommend when you design a custom loop to design a drain valve into it. I have one in the back right here behind the pump that'll allow me to drain the loop. If you don't have a drain valve, it gets a lot more complicated. And with a drain valve, essentially all I do is attach an extra fitting I have here to a piece of scrap hose, and then I dump it into a regular bottle, and it makes it really easy to empty the system out. And once you have the system drained and cleaned up, then it's time to actually put it back together. And when you do that, it's a really good idea to leak test it ahead of time. In fact, it's necessary to leak test it. The last thing you want to do is have a loose fitting or even a cap missing to cause a lot of problems. So for that, I highly recommend the EK leak tester. These things really aren't that expensive, and honestly, if it causes your system to not fail, it's definitely worth the price. They really don't cost a lot. However, if you really don't want to spend the money on one of these, you can leak test it with some paper towels. And I'll show you how to do that once we dig into it. Another tool that you should use is this little adapter right here that will actually cause the power supply to turn on without the system. These actually come with most new power supplies, at least if you buy some name brand power supplies. If you don't have one, I highly recommend ordering one. This is a really good tool to keep around. And also, you're going to need some fluid to actually put into your system. Now, when I built this system originally, I used EK Cryo Fuel. I used the concentrate, and it worked out really well. And I have some pre-mixed right here that we're actually going to use in this system, but it's not hard to mix. It's actually really easy. And one of these bottles, depending on the size of your loop, can go a pretty long ways. In fact, this is the one from the time I originally built the system, so it does actually stretch pretty far. So now, without further ado, let's tear into this thing and see if we can make a mess. Or hopefully we won't make a mess. Let's see how it goes. Okay, like I said in the intro, first thing we need to do is actually drain the fluid that's currently in the lines, because our goal at first here is to get this graphics card out. And to do that, we're gonna have to actually remove this line right here, because the card won't come out with it in the way. But in order to remove it, we have to get the fluid out of the system. And for this right here, I actually have a drain valve that's right behind the pump right here. Let me show you. As you can see, right here behind the pump, there's a drain valve with a cap right on the end of it right there. And what we want to do is we want to actually attach our hose right here to the back of this drain valve so we can actually drain the system. So I'm going to go ahead and hook that up, and we'll do that right now. So now that we have this hose attached, there's one more thing that we need to do before we drain the fluid out. And that's, we need to give air a path to flow. And in order to do that, we're going to have to take a cap off that's up in the top of the system. I like to take my actual fill cap off so it allows the air to replace the fluid as it comes out. And to do that, you essentially just take the cap and pull it off just like this. And then once you have it off, make sure you get yourself a bottle to actually drain this thing into. Put this hose into the bottle, and then as soon as you hit this little trigger right here or open this valve, it'll empty the fluid into the bottle. So we're going to do that right now, and you'll see what happens. And there it goes. The fluid drains out of the system. The bigger I open the valve, the faster the fluid will come out. And it's going to drain for a minute until it gets to the point to where it can't drain any more fluid. So by tilting the system up like this, it's actually helping me to get a little bit more of the fluid out of it. And the way I have this loop set up, the inlet and the outlet on the radiator are actually up on the top. So this radiator is still full of fluid. In order to get that drained out, I'm gonna show you what I do to do that. And it's a little more difficult, but you know, it helps in the long run if you know this. So you're gonna get as much fluid out of it as you can. So I'm gonna go ahead and close the drain valve completely now. We're gonna move this bottle out of the way. And at this point, I'm actually going to flip the system up onto its back to hopefully get all of that fluid to flow out of the radiator into the rest of the loop. Now we're getting a lot more fluid that's coming down here, but if we tilt it up, we can definitely get more out of the radiators. And as you can see these tubes filling up right here? This is actually the fluid that's coming out of the radiator. And one thing you want to make sure is, like I actually didn't, is make sure you put your inlet cap back on. That was kind of stupid. That could have caused a big mess. Luckily, it didn't, but it could have. All right, so as you can see, these hoses are actually filling back up from all of the fluid that actually went into the reservoir. And now we can go ahead and open up this valve again and get that fluid out now too. All right, there we go. We got as much fluid as we possibly could out of the system. Now it's time to close this valve right here. Make sure you put the filler cap back on the top, filler cap back on the top, filler cap back on the top. But like I said, we're gonna make a mess, right? And it looks like we have. So let's try this again now. Once you get as much fluid out as you can, go ahead and close your valve. And once your valve is closed, you can reinsert your filler cap to make sure the system's sealed at this point. And then I'm gonna go ahead and take this hose off and we're gonna get to repasting the CPU. So now that we're at this point here with all the fluid out of the system, the next step I'm gonna do is actually tearing that video card out of there so it gets it out of our way. And to do that, all loops are gonna be different, but I have a couple of 90-degree fittings with swivels here. So you simply have to unscrew them. Sometimes they can be a little tight though. And at this point, we want to be really careful once we pull stuff off, because at this point we have fluid that can leak anywhere. And for that, we definitely want to kind of keep things as clean as possible. All right, so that one's out of the way. And now we can actually pull the graphics card out of there. And then once we do that, I'm going to go ahead and pull the CPU block off so we can do some new paste on it. Okay, so to remove the CPU block, we need to disconnect these two fittings right here. And to do that, these are just compression fittings. So all you have to do is just loosen the lock nut on the outside and it should thread off. And at that point, the little sleeve will actually come down so you can actually pull the hose off of the CPU block. It's a good idea to actually twist the hose back and forth to kind of break its seal so it makes it a little bit easier to get off. And to do that, you essentially just kind of just turn it back and forth a little bit. There we go. Eventually you're going to turn it and it's going to come loose. And then you should be able just to squeeze it off. And take your time on this because you don't want to actually crack the block itself. And you also don't want fluid to drip out either. In fact, it'd be a good idea at this point to actually put something down just in case fluid does leak. And there we go. So now we've got one hose free here. Now, all we need to do is get the other hose off. And it's essentially the same process with the other hose too. So now to get the CPU block itself off, we want to undo these 4 screws around the side right here. And also this CPU block has RGB on it. So we have an RGB line that actually goes up into the back of the case. So I'm going to unplug that right now. Okay, I have the RGB unplugged and disconnected, and we can actually start pulling the CPU block off. And what I would recommend doing is unloosening it from the corners just like you would a tire on your car. You want to do it evenly spaced across all 4 corners so that the CPU block isn't pressing down uneven on the socket. All right. So the thermal paste application actually doesn't look that bad, but now that we have it off, we're going to go ahead and clean it off so we can make room for some more thermal paste. So now that we have the CPU block out, we can actually take a look inside and see how dirty it is and see if we need to take it apart to clean it. Now this one here, honestly, it looks beautiful inside. It doesn't look like it looks like exactly the way it was the first day I got it. And honestly, I think at this point it would be a complete waste of time to tear this thing down to clean it. However, we do need to actually put some new thermal paste on, and for that, we need to clean the thermal paste off of the CPU block as well as the CPU. Now, I've already got the CPU block itself clean, but I'm gonna go now and actually clean the thermal paste off of the CPU. Okay, to reassemble everything, it should just be a reverse of the way that you took it apart. I'm just gonna start by adding my fittings back to my CPU block here. I like to put the fittings on ahead of time before I actually put the CPU block in. It just makes it a little bit easier doing it this way. And then when it comes to acrylic blocks, you want to make sure that when you tighten these fittings down, you don't want to just crank them with everything that you got. Just snug is fine, because if you crank it any more than that, you could take a chance of actually doing little stress fractures and stuff in the block itself. And it's not worth it. These things are kind of expensive, so you definitely don't want to crack them. So now I'm going to go ahead and add some thermal compound to this thing, and we'll start bolting her back together. All right, now that our thermal compound is applied, we can actually get to installing the block itself. And for that, we just slide it on. You want to make sure to add these springs right here because they actually help to retain the block itself. They put pressure down on the block and actually make it press down further onto the CPU, because these nuts themselves actually bottom out. You really can't over tighten these because it uses the spring pressure itself to actually push down on the CPU. It makes it work pretty good, actually. All right, now that we have those tightened up, we can go ahead and reattach our hoses here. I'm going to spin this one around until it lines up, and then we're just going to push it right over the fitting. And then from there, we're going to reattach our sleeve, and that should tighten the hose down to the fitting. And the hose I'm using in this system is the Primo Chill LRT, and it's actually done a pretty good job. It has a little bit of discoloration in it, but it's really not that bad. It's not as bad as I've seen other hoses get in the past. It's definitely not perfect, but it's not bad. Okay, so now that we have that hooked up, we can go ahead and hook up our final hose here. I'm going to go ahead and connect our VGA power first, just so I don't forget. And then we're going to hook this hose up here. And this honestly really isn't that hard because they're just swivel fittings. So, and like before, just make sure you don't over tighten these, because by over tightening them, you can actually take the chance of cracking the acrylic. Looks like it's almost ready for fluid. But first, we need to actually pressure test it and make sure there aren't any leaks. And for that, I'm going to use our EK pressure tester kit. Let me show you how to use this. Okay, the way I do this is through the drain valve itself, because the drain valve actually gives us a really good access to the loop that can be closed off. So to do that, I'm actually going to leave the drain valve turned off just in case there's residual fluid or something in the system. I don't want it to leak out onto my hard drives. That would be really bad. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to attach a swivel fitting to the drain valve itself. And then on the swivel fitting, I'm going to attach the EK leak tester kit itself. Okay, so now that we have the leak tester kit actually installed on the system, we want to go ahead and attach our pump right here to the Schrader valve in the back. And then once it's attached, we want to go ahead and open the drain valve at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to open my drain valve and make sure to open the valve in the kit itself, in the actual tester. And then from that point, you pump it up between 0.5 and 0.75 bar. And if there's no leaks in the system, it should be able to hold that pressure for a period of time. So I'm going to pump it right up to 0.75. And then from this point, you want to make sure to close the actual valve that's on the leak tester kit itself, because I've had a situation in the past where the actual pump itself leaked down a little bit. So make sure you close that off. And then at that point, you can just sit back and wait and see how it goes. I would let it go for about 10-15 minutes. And if it holds that pressure for that period of time, then you should be good to go. So we're gonna take a short intermission, and when we get back, hopefully she'll still have pressure. I'll see you then.
Many minutes later.
Okay, so it's been actually about 20-25 minutes or so, and I'm still sitting at the exact same spot I was when I started this. So I think we're good. We definitely have enough pressure in the system, and I don't think we're gonna have any leaks. However, there is a way to do a leak test on a system if you don't have a tool like this to do it, and I'm gonna show you how to do that now. So I'm gonna go ahead and disconnect all this, and we'll flip the computer around, and I'm gonna show you another way to leak test your system. And even if you are using a tool like this, it's still a good idea to do it this way too. So let me get that done, and we'll be right back to it. Okay, so the way you would leak test your system without any special tools is essentially the old-fashioned way. What we're gonna do is we're actually going to set some paper towels on all the surfaces that could possibly get wet. And that's gonna be underneath every fitting that you see here. So we're actually gonna take these paper towels and just set them up just like this. Now, I highly recommend using white paper towels because the white will actually contrast the color of the fluid, because obviously we're using blue fluid. And since we're using blue fluid, if you have a leak, it's gonna show up really obvious on the fluid if that happens. All I'm doing here is I'm taking these paper towels and I'm putting them across areas where the fluid could possibly leak. Obviously, it's not gonna leak in the middle of a tube unless you have a hole in the tube. So it's actually gonna leak at one of these fitting areas. So I'm gonna take that, I'm gonna put these in these spots where I think it might leak. But the next thing that we're gonna do though, is we're actually gonna use one of these little adapters here. And this adapter will actually allow the computer to power the system without the motherboard actually plugged in. So I have the motherboard unplugged, and I'm gonna hook this little adapter up right here. All right, and once that's hooked up, I can go ahead and apply power to the computer. And one thing you want to be really careful with is you want to make sure that the power supply is turned off when you do this, because if it's turned on, the second you plug the power in, it's going to start actually pumping the pump inside of your system right here. And if you run that dry, you can actually cause damage to the pump. You don't want to do that. So what we're going to do is, before we turn the power supply on, I'm going to go ahead and start getting some fluid into the system. So by doing that, I take the filler cap off, and we're going to slowly start pumping some fluid into here. And I would highly recommend picking up this filler bottle from EK. It definitely makes this job so much easier. But now that we're getting fluid through the tubes here, we can kind of look and we can see, just to make sure that we're not getting any blue spots on any of our paper towels. So it's going to take a little while for us to actually start getting this fluid in here. We're actually filling up the pump right here. And when it comes to water cooling, it's best to take your time and make sure that everything goes smoothly rather than trying to fix something after the fact, because fixing it after the fact sometimes can entail replacing parts, and that's not fun for sure. So now that we have fluid in our reservoir, I'm going to go ahead and give it power, and it's going to start pumping it through. But you want to make sure that you do not run the pump dry. So you just want to do short intervals just to get the fluid pumping through the system. So I'm going to start doing that right now. And there we go. All right, so now that we got it started there, we're just going to keep repeating, putting some more fluid into the system until we actually get this thing filled up. All right, we got the reservoir filled again, and I'm going to go ahead and give it power. And there she goes. And kill the power again. So now, as you can see, we're actually getting fluid into the CPU block now. We've almost got enough fluid through the system to where it can actually sustain itself. So I'm going to go ahead and fill up this reservoir one more time. And now we should be able to just let it go now. Let's find out. All right, there we go. So now we want to go ahead and just top off the fluid, and it's going to take a while for the actual air bubbles and stuff like that to get out of the system, but that's just part of it. So I'm going to go ahead and top off this reservoir now. And there we go. The fluid actually kind of has an opaque look to it right now, but it's just because there's a lot of air bubbles in it. Those will actually subside over time, and eventually it'll be just like it was at the beginning of the video, where the fluid is nice, crystal clear. Unless, of course, you decided to use opaque fluid. All right, now we can put our filler cap back on. And at this point, just sit and wait. Wait and make sure that you don't have any stains on any of these pieces of paper towel. And as long as it comes out good, I would let it run for a couple hours. Some people suggest 24 hours, but honestly, if it doesn't leak within the first 2 or 3 hours, it's not gonna leak in 24, so you should be okay. However, if you used a leak tester, like this EK one right here, then you shouldn't have to do this at all. It should work fine. However, it doesn't hurt giving it a little bit of extra time, just making sure there are no leaks. Make sure at this point, as the air bubbles come out of the system, your reservoir is actually gonna drop. So you wanna make sure over the next couple hours to couple of days to keep a really close eye on your reservoir and make sure that stays full. But at this point, there's really no chance of your pump going dry unless you have a major leak or a really small reservoir. But other than that, I hope this was helpful to you, and if it was, then please like this video. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and hit that bell icon so you can be notified of future videos. I post a new video every week. And hey, before you go, check out a couple of these videos. Have a great day.